The small town of Willow Brook was silent, except for the muffled sobs of the few people gathered at the cemetery. The coffin of Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, a wealthy and powerful woman, lay in the ground, ready to be buried. Eleanor had been a figure of both admiration and fear in the town. She was known for her sharp business deals and her connections in high places, but whispers of her corruption and greed had always followed her like a shadow. As the priest finished his prayers, Eleanor's family stepped forward to say their final goodbyes. Her husband Richard and her daughter Clara stood by the coffin, their faces pale and emotionless. The townsfolk watched from a distance, some out of respect, others out of curiosity. No one had expected Eleanor's death to be so sudden, and no one had expected what happened next. Clara leaned over to kiss her mother's forehead one last time. But as she did, she froze. Her eyes widened in horror. "Dad, look at her neck," she whispered, her voice trembling. Richard stepped closer, his heart pounding. There, on Eleanor's neck, was a strange swelling and a small, visible hole. It looked unnatural, as if something had been inserted or removed. The family exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. The whispers among the crowd grew louder. "What's happening?" someone asked. "Why does she look like that?" another murmured. The tension in the air was palpable. Clara, unable to contain her fear, stepped back and called out, "Someone call the police! And the church! Something's wrong!" The crowd erupted into chaos. People pulled out their phones, dialing frantically. Within minutes, the local police arrived, followed by the town's priest, Father Michael. The officer in charge, Detective Harris, was a no-nonsense man with a reputation for solving the toughest cases. He took one look at Eleanor's neck and knew this wasn't an ordinary death. Father Michael, an elderly man with a calm demeanor, approached the coffin. He crossed himself and began to pray softly. After a moment, he looked up at the family and the crowd. This is not natural," he said gravely. "It seems as though she has been marked. Perhaps punished for her sins." The word sent a chill through everyone present. Punished? By whom? And for what? The mystery deepened, and the fear in the air grew thicker. Detective Harris knew he had to act fast. "Everyone step back," he ordered. "This is now a crime scene. No one leaves until we get some answers." As the police cordoned off the area, Clara and Richard stood in stunned silence. They had always known Eleanor was a complicated woman, but this was beyond anything they could have imagined. What had she done? And what secrets had she taken to her grave? The investigation was about to begin, and the truth would come at a cost. Detective Harris wasted no time. He ordered his team to secure the scene and began questioning the family and the few townsfolk who had attended the funeral. Clara and Richard were visibly shaken, but they cooperated, answering every question as best as they could. However, it was clear they knew very little about Eleanor's darker dealings. "Did your mother have any enemies?" Harris asked Clara, his tone firm but not unkind. Clara hesitated, then nodded slowly. She wasn't always liked. Some people in town thought she was too ruthless in her business. But enemies? I don't know. Richard chimed in, his voice low. There were rumors about her taking advantage of people. Poor families losing their homes, small businesses going under because of her. But we never thought much of it. She always said it was just business. Harris scribbled notes in his pad, his mind racing. If Eleanor had been involved in shady dealings, it was possible someone had wanted revenge. But the strange mark on her neck suggested something more sinister, something deliberate. Meanwhile, Father Michael stood by the coffin, deep in thought. He had seen many things in his years as a priest, but this felt different. He approached Harris cautiously. "Detective, I believe this may be more than just a crime. There's something unnatural about this. That mark on her neck. It's not something a human could have done." Harris raised an eyebrow. "Are you saying this is some kind of divine punishment?" Father Michael sighed. "I'm saying we should consider all possibilities. Eleanor Grayson was not a kind woman. If she wronged people, perhaps this is the consequence." Harris wasn't one to believe in supernatural explanations, But he couldn't ignore the priest's words entirely. He decided to focus on the facts. First, he needed to find out who had access to Eleanor's body before the funeral. He turned to Clara. "Who prepared your mother's body for burial?" Clara thought for a moment. "It was Mr. Thompson, the funeral director. He's been in town for years. He's always handled these things." Harris nodded and immediately sent an officer to bring Mr. Thompson in for questioning. While they waited, he examined the coffin more closely. The swelling on Eleanor's neck was strange, almost like an allergic reaction. But the small hole was what troubled him the most. It was too precise to be accidental. When Mr. Thompson arrived, he was visibly nervous. "Detective, I swear, I didn't do anything wrong. I prepared her body just like I always do. I noticed the swelling, but I thought it was just, I don't know, something natural." Harris studied the man's face, looking for any signs of deceit. "Did anyone else have access to the body?" Thompson shook his head. "No, just me, but wait. There was one thing. A man came by the funeral home the night before the service. He said he was a distant relative and wanted to pay his respects. I let him see the body, but only for a few minutes." Harris's eyes narrowed. "Did you get his name?" Thompson hesitated. "No. He didn't give it. He was tall, wore a dark coat. I didn't think much of it at the time." This was the first real lead. Harris turned to his team. "I want everyone in town questioned. Look for anyone who might have had a grudge against Eleanor Grayson, and find out who this mysterious visitor was." As the investigation unfolded, the town of Willowbrook buzzed with speculation. People whispered about curses, revenge, and justice. But one thing was clear. Eleanor Grayson's death was no ordinary passing. Something dark and hidden was about to come to light. Detective Harris and his team fanned out across Willowbrook, knocking on doors and questioning anyone who might have information about Eleanor Grayson or the mysterious visitor at the funeral home. The town was small, and news traveled fast. Soon everyone was talking about the strange mark on Eleanor's neck and the possibility of foul play. One name kept coming up in the interviews: Victor Lane. Victor was a local handyman who had worked for Eleanor on several occasions. He was known to have a temper, and there were rumors that he had clashed with Eleanor over unpaid wages. Harris decided to pay Victor a visit. Victor lived in a rundown house on the outskirts of town. When Harris arrived, he found the man tinkering with an old car in the driveway. Victor looked up, his face hardening as he recognized the detective. "What do you want?" Victor asked, his tone defensive. "I need to ask you a few questions about Eleanor Grayson," Harris replied, keeping his voice calm but firm. Victor's eyes narrowed. "That woman got what she deserved. I'm not sorry she's dead." Harris raised an eyebrow. "That's a strong statement. Care to explain?" Victor crossed his arms. "She owed me money. A lot of money. I did work for her and she refused to pay. Said I didn't do a good enough job. But I know the truth. She just didn't want to part with her precious cash." Harris made a note of this. "Did you confront her about it?" "Yeah, I did. And she threatened me. Said she had friends in high places and that I'd regret it if I pushed her. But I didn't care. I just wanted what was mine." Harris studied Victor's face. The man was clearly bitter, but did he have it in him to kill? "Where were you the night before Eleanor's funeral?" Victor hesitated for a moment. "I was at home, alone." Harris nodded, making a mental note to verify Victor's alibi. "One more thing. Did you visit the funeral home to see Eleanor's body?" Victor's eyes widened in surprise. "What? No? Why would I do that? I didn't want anything to do with her, alive or dead." Harris thanked Victor for his time and left, his mind racing. Victor had motive but no clear connection to the mysterious visitor. The detective needed to dig deeper. Back at the station, Harris reviewed the notes from his team's interviews. One name stood out: Samuel Briggs. Samuel was a former business partner of Eleanor's who had fallen on hard times after their partnership ended badly. According to rumors, Samuel had lost everything because of Eleanor's underhanded tactics. Harris decided to pay Samuel a visit. He found the man in a small, cluttered apartment, surrounded by stacks of paperwork and empty bottles. Samuel looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Samuel Briggs?" Harris asked. Samuel looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "Yeah. What do you want?" "I need to ask you about Eleanor Grayson." Samuel's face darkened. "That witch ruined my life. I had a successful business and she took it all from me. Left me with nothing." Harris nodded sympathetically. "I'm sorry to hear that. Did you ever confront her about it?" Samuel laughed bitterly. "Confront her? I tried. But she had too much power. She had connections everywhere. No one would listen to me." Harris leaned in closer. "Did you visit the funeral home the night before her funeral?" Samuel's expression changed, a flicker of fear crossing his face. "Why are you asking me that?" "Because someone did. And I need to know if it was you." Samuel hesitated, then sighed. "Yeah, it was me. I wanted to see her one last time, to make sure she was really gone." Harris's eyes narrowed. "Did you do anything to her body?" Samuel shook his head vehemently. "No, I just wanted to see her, to know it was over." Harris studied Samuel carefully. The man seemed genuine, but Harris couldn't be sure. He needed more evidence. As he left Samuel's apartment, Harris's phone rang. It was one of his officers. "Detective, we found something. You need to see this." Harris hurried back to the station, where his officer handed him a file. Inside were photographs of Eleanor's financial records, showing large sums of money being transferred to offshore accounts. But what caught Harris's attention was a name that appeared repeatedly: Marcus Reed. "Who is Marcus Reed?" Harris asked. The officer shook his head. "We're not sure yet, but he seems to have been involved in some of Eleanor's dealings. We're trying to track him down." Harris felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the break he needed. Marcus Reed could be the key to unraveling the mystery of Eleanor's death and the shocking discovery in her coffin. Detective Harris dove into the investigation of Marcus Reed with renewed determination. The name had appeared too many times in Eleanor's financial records to be a coincidence. Who was this man, and what was his connection to Eleanor Grayson? Harris ordered his team to pull every record they could find on Marcus Reed, from bank statements to property records. It didn't take long for the pieces to start coming together. Marcus Reed was a wealthy businessman with a reputation for being ruthless in his dealings. He had ties to several high-profile politicians and was known to operate in the shadows, avoiding the public eye. But his connection to Eleanor was the most intriguing. The two had been involved in multiple business ventures together, and it seemed that Marcus had been the one pulling the strings behind many of Eleanor's controversial deals. Harris decided to pay Marcus a visit. He arrived at Marcus's sprawling estate, a mansion surrounded by high walls and security cameras. The detective was met at the gate by a stern-looking security guard. "I'm here to see Marcus Reed," Harris said, flashing his badge. "It's about Eleanor Grayson." The guard hesitated, then spoke into his radio. After a moment, the gate buzzed open. Harris was led into the mansion, where Marcus Reed was waiting in a lavish study, seated behind a massive oak desk. He was a tall, imposing man with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. "Detective Harris," Marcus said, his voice smooth but laced with tension. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I'm investigating the death of Eleanor Grayson," Harris replied, keeping his tone neutral. "Your name came up in her financial records. I was hoping you could shed some light on your relationship with her." Marcus leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Eleanor was a business associate. We worked on a few projects together, but that's all. I hadn't seen her in months before her death." Harris wasn't convinced. "Your name appears repeatedly in her records. Large sums of money were transferred to offshore accounts under your name. Care to explain?" Marcus's smile faded. "I'm a businessman, detective. I have many investments. If Eleanor chose to involve me in her dealings, that's her prerogative. I had no control over her actions." Harris leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Did you know that Eleanor was accused of scamming poor families out of their homes and businesses? That she was under investigation for corruption?" Marcus's expression remained impassive. "I'm aware of the rumors, but as I said, I had no involvement in her personal affairs." Harris knew he was getting nowhere. Marcus was too skilled at deflecting questions. But the detective wasn't ready to give up. "One more thing, did you visit Eleanor's body at the funeral home before her burial?" Marcus's eyes flickered for a moment, a brief crack in his composed facade. "Why would I do that?" "Because someone did, and I need to know if it was you." Marcus stood, his voice cold. "I think we're done here, Detective. If you have any further questions, you can speak to my lawyer." Harris left the mansion, frustrated but not defeated. He knew Marcus was hiding something, but he needed more evidence to prove it. As he drove back to the station, his phone rang. It was Clara Grayson. "Detective Harris, I need to talk to you," Clara said, her voice trembling. "I found something in my mother's house, something I think it's important." Harris's heart raced. "I'll be right there." When he arrived at the Grayson estate, Clara led him to Eleanor's study. The room was filled with books, files, and expensive artwork. Clara handed Harris a small locked box. "I found this hidden in her desk. I don't know what's inside, but I think it might be connected to everything." Harris took the box and examined it. It was sturdy, with a combination lock. He tried a few obvious combinations, but it didn't open. "Do you know the code?" Clara shook her head. "Number. But my mother always used important dates. Maybe her birthday?" Harris tried Eleanor's birth date, and the lock clicked open. Inside the box was a stack of documents, photographs, and a USB drive. Harris's eyes widened as he flipped through the papers. They were detailed records of Eleanor's dealings with Marcus Reed, including evidence of bribes, blackmail, and illegal transactions. The USB drive contained audio recordings of conversations between Eleanor and Marcus, discussing their plans to exploit vulnerable people and cover their tracks. "This is it," Harris said, his voice filled with determination. "This is the evidence we need." Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and sorrow. "My mother. She was involved in all of this." Harris nodded. "I'm sorry, Clara, but this will help us bring the truth to light. And maybe, just maybe, we can get justice for the people she hurt." As Harris left the Grayson estate, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. But he knew the fight wasn't over. Marcus Reed was a powerful man, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. With the evidence from Eleanor's hidden box in hand, Detective Harris moved quickly. He gathered his team and briefed them on the findings. The documents and recordings were damning, proof of Marcus Reed's involvement in Eleanor's corrupt schemes, as well as his own illegal activities. Harris knew they had to act fast before Marcus could destroy any more evidence or use his connections to evade justice. The next morning, Harris and a team of officers arrived at Marcus Reed's mansion. This time they weren't asking questions, they had a warrant. The security guards tried to block their entry, but Harris flashed the warrant and pushed past them. Inside, they found Marcus in his study, calmly sipping a cup of coffee as if he had been expecting them. "Marcus Reed," Harris said, his voice firm. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, bribery, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Marcus set down his coffee cup and smiled faintly. "You think you've won, don't you, Detective? You think this little stunt will bring me down?" Harris didn't respond. He simply motioned for the officers to cuff Marcus and lead him out of the mansion. The media had already caught wind of the arrest, and cameras flashed as Marcus was escorted to the police car. The once powerful businessman now looked vulnerable, his cold demeanor cracking under the weight of the public spectacle. Back at the station, Harris began the interrogation. Marcus sat across from him, his lawyer by his side, but the smugness in his eyes had faded. Harris laid out the evidence, the documents, the recordings, the financial records. He played one of the audio clips, Marcus's voice filling the room as he discussed bribing a government official to cover up one of Eleanor's schemes. "You're done, Marcus," Harris said, leaning across the table. "We have everything we need to put you away for a long time. But if you cooperate, if you tell us the full extent of your involvement, it might go easier on you." Marcus glanced at his lawyer, who nodded slightly. After a long pause, Marcus sighed and began to talk. He confessed to his partnership with Eleanor, detailing how they had exploited vulnerable people for profit. He admitted to bribing officials, manipulating evidence, and using his connections to silence anyone who tried to expose them. But as he spoke, something unexpected happened. Marcus broke down. "I didn't want it to go this far," he said, his voice trembling. "Eleanor. She was ruthless. She pushed me to do things I never would have done on my own. But I couldn't stop her. She had too much power over me." Harris listened intently, his mind racing. Marcus's confession was a goldmine of information, but it also raised new questions. What had Eleanor done to make Marcus so afraid of her? And who else was involved in their schemes? As the interrogation continued, Marcus revealed one final shocking detail. The mark on her neck, and it wasn't me. But I know who did it. It was one of the people she ruined. Someone who wanted revenge. Harris's eyes widened. "Who?" Marcus hesitated, then whispered a name. "Victor Lane." Detective Harris wasted no time. With Marcus Reed's confession pointing the finger at Victor Lane, Harris and his team rushed to Victor's run-down house on the outskirts of town. The pieces were finally falling into place. Victor had motive. Eleanor had cheated him out of his money and threatened him. And now it seemed he had taken his revenge in the most shocking way possible. When they arrived, Victor was in his garage, tinkering with the same old car Harris had seen him working on before. He looked up as the officers approached, his face pale but resigned. He didn't try to run or resist. Instead, he simply set down his tools and raised his hands. "I knew you'd come," Victor said quietly. "I just didn't think it would be this soon." Harris stepped forward, his voice firm but not unkind. "Victor Lane, you're under arrest for the murder of Eleanor Grayson. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Victor nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I'll come quietly, but I want to tell you everything. You deserve to know the truth." Back at the station, Victor sat in the interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the table. Harris sat across from him, ready to listen. Victor took a deep breath and began his story. "Eleanor Grayson ruined my life," he said, his voice filled with bitterness. "I worked for her, did everything she asked, and she refused to pay me. When I confronted her, she laughed in my face. She said I was nothing, that no one would believe me over her. And she was right. I tried to take her to court, but her lawyers crushed me. I lost everything, my savings, my house, my dignity." Harris nodded, encouraging Victor to continue. "After that, I was angry. So angry. I wanted her to pay for what she did to me, to all of us. But I didn't know how. Then one night I overheard some guys at the bar talking about how Eleanor had screwed them over too. They said she had a weak spot, her neck. She had some kind of medical condition, and if you hit her just right, it could kill her. I didn't believe it at first, but I was desperate." Victor paused, his hands trembling. "The night before her funeral, I went to the funeral home. I told the director I was a relative, and he let me see her. I brought a needle with me. I didn't know if it would work, but I had to try. I injected something into her neck, something that would make it look like she'd been punished. I wanted everyone to see what she really was, a monster." Harris leaned forward, his voice steady. "What did you inject her with?" Victor shook his head. "Just air. I read somewhere that injecting air into someone's bloodstream could kill them. I didn't know if it would work on a dead body, but I guess it did something. I didn't mean for it to look so dramatic. I just wanted her to suffer, even in death." Harris sat back, processing Victor's confession. It was a twisted, desperate act of revenge, but it made sense. Victor had been pushed to the edge, and he had snapped. But there was still one question lingering in Harris's mind. "Why did you come forward now?" Harris asked. "You could have kept quiet. No one would have suspected you." Victor looked down at his hands, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because I couldn't live with it anymore. I thought revenge would make me feel better. But it didn't. It just made me feel emptier. And when I saw how scared everyone was at the funeral, how they thought it was some kind of divine punishment, I realized I had gone too far. I didn't want to hurt anyone else. I just wanted it to be over." Harris nodded slowly. Victor's confession was heartbreaking, but it was also a relief. The mystery of Eleanor's death was finally solved. Now it was time to bring closure to the people she had hurt. With Victor Lane's confession and Marcus Reed's cooperation, Detective Harris had everything he needed to bring the case to a close. The evidence was overwhelming, and the truth about Eleanor Grayson's corrupt dealings was finally exposed. But for Harris, the work wasn't done yet. He knew that justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty, it was also about helping the victims heal. Harris and his team worked tirelessly to track down the people Eleanor had scammed. Using the financial records and documents from Eleanor's hidden box, they identified dozens of families and small business owners who had lost their homes, savings, and livelihoods because of her greed. One by one, Harris reached out to them, offering not only the chance to recover their money but also the opportunity to tell their stories. The case made national headlines. Eleanor Grayson, once a respected and feared figure, was now exposed as a fraud and a criminal. The media dubbed it the Coffin Mystery, and the story captivated the public's imagination. But for the people of Willowbrook, it was more than just a sensational tale. It was a chance for justice. The court proceedings were swift. Marcus Reed, facing multiple charges of fraud, bribery, and conspiracy, struck a plea deal in exchange for his testimony. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, a fraction of what he could have faced, but enough to ensure he would never wield power over others again. Victor Lane, charged with desecration of a body and manslaughter, received a lighter sentence due to his cooperation and the circumstances that had driven him to act. He was sentenced to 5 years with the possibility of parole, but the real victory came for the victims. With the help of the court, Harris ensured that the money Eleanor had stolen was returned to those she had wronged. Families were able to reclaim their homes and small businesses were given a second chance. It wasn't a perfect solution. Nothing could undo the pain and suffering Eleanor had caused, but it was a step toward healing. One of the most emotional moments came when Clara Grayson, Eleanor's daughter, stood before the court. She had been through so much, losing her mother, discovering the truth about her crimes, and grappling with the guilt of being connected to such a scandal. But instead of hiding from the past, Clara chose to face it head-on. "I know my mother hurt a lot of people," Clara said, her voice trembling but strong. "And I can't change what she did, but I want to apologize on behalf of my family to everyone she wronged. I hope that in some small way we can make things right." Her words brought tears to the eyes of many in the courtroom. It was a moment of catharsis, a chance for the community to come together and begin to move forward. As the case drew to a close, Detective Harris stood outside the courthouse, watching as the people of Willowbrook slowly dispersed. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not just from solving the case but from knowing he had made a difference. The mystery of Eleanor Grayson's death had been solved, but more importantly, the truth had been revealed, and justice had been served. But as Harris turned to leave, he couldn't shake one lingering thought. The mark on Eleanor's neck, the small hole that had started it all, was it really just Victor's doing? Or was there something more, something beyond human understanding, that had played a role? Harris wasn't a superstitious man, but he couldn't help but wonder if Father Michael had been right all along. Maybe, just maybe, Eleanor had been marked by something greater, a force that ensured she would face the consequences of her actions, even in death. As Harris walked away, the sun setting over Willowbrook, he felt a sense of peace. The case was closed, but the lessons it had taught would stay with him forever. Justice, he realized, wasn't just about punishment, it was about truth, accountability, and the hope of a better future.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.